Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you today to introduce Joaquin Noguera. Joaquin is currently a postdoctoral fellow with the UCSB Center for Black Studies Research, where he's working with Sharon Tedegaud's director on a multi-case study of identity development of STEM students at a cluster of HBCU and HSI universities. This past year, Joaquin has also taught a course on urban experiences and racism in the Department of Black Studies. By way of background, Joaquin received his PhD in 2020 at UCLA in the Graduate School of Education and Information Sciences, specializing in race, ethnic and cultural studies. Joaquin has experience as a former school leader and teacher, and he has supported educators, school districts, and other learning organizations across the U.S. for the past 10 years, focusing on equity and community responsiveness and culturally sustaining, revitalizing social justice and healing practices. As a researcher, Dr. Noguera's work examines education and schooling as a mechanism for social and cultural reproduction and also their potential for transformation. It'll be very interesting to hear his commentary on the notion of healing, given Julie's introductory recognition of indigenous peoples. And I know that Joaquin has been exploring the work of Megan Bang and others who are looking at issues of restorative justice and understanding the importance of settings as places where we build and transform our understanding of each other. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Joaquin.
Thank you, Richard. Appreciate you your introduction, and thank you, Julie. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. I planned, I didn't know that you all were gonna start us off with some acknowledgements. So I just wanted to also say that in the spirit of healing and justice, I want to acknowledge and honor the indigenous people of this land, pay respect to ancestors, elders, and our relatives, relations past, present, and emerging, and recognize our obligations to those communities. As was already stated, UC Santa Barbara is on Chumash land. I'm calling from Los Angeles, which is Gabrielino Tongva land. And I also wanted to acknowledge the peoples who were brought to this land against their will, those who continue to come to this land to develop this land. I just also want to say it's so beautiful to see so many of you today. We are still in this pandemic and have been separated for quite some time. So I'm seeing faces that I love, some faces I don't know yet, and I hope to know soon. But it's a pleasure to share space with you all. I'm really grateful to Dr. Tedegaud for the opportunity to share, to be a part of this community, and to Dr. Julie Bianchini and Dr. Duran for creating this space and allowing me to share some words and some ideas with you all today. Let me minimize that so I don't distract myself. The title of my talk today is Race, Culture, Education, and the Limits and Possibilities of Schooling. The limits and possibilities of schooling is a way of viewing the challenges that urban communities and urban schools face that I learned from Paulo Freire, who described the challenges as limit situations. So some of what I'm talking about today will help to clarify some of the limit situations, the challenges we face. But I'm also deeply invested in the possibilities of schooling, possibilities of learning organizations to create change, healthy, healing change. So that's what I'm here to share with you all today. A little bit of what I've learned about these issues. I want to start by acknowledging who I am. If you ever go to a community for the first time that is tightly knit, you will often be asked, who are you and where are you from? And as a researcher, I have found that positionality, the parts of our identity that shape how we show up, that shape how we're received, are really important as researchers. So I want to acknowledge that I come from and stand on the shoulders of Patricia Rocio Batuone Mujica, My mother, who was a Peruvian-born immigrant, came here when she was 6 years old. And Pedro Antonio Noguera, who was born in New York, but born to immigrants as well from Jamaica and Trinidad, and with roots in Venezuela, who I would not be here without. I'm also a part of a big and beautiful family, many of whom are here now. My mother is not here in her physical body anymore, but I and my family all continues to heal from the experience of living with her and watching her leave us. I'm the eldest of my siblings, and I come from a big, beautiful tribe called the Noguera clan and the Mojica clan. And so it's an honor to be able to share as a representative of my people. I also happen to be a husband and father to two amazing little beings, Shanti and Vicente, and we have Maceo on his way. He'll be here in August, so stay tuned. I think it's also not tongue-in-cheek, but I come from a pretty well-known scholar out there by the name of Pedro Antonio Noguera, who has written extensively on some of the issues that I have and studied and researched extensively, issues that I too have taken up. But this is also a part of my positionality, because from the time before I can remember, I was a part of these conversations. I was listening to these conversations. I cared about what was happening. And eventually my father even made me a subject of some of his writing. One of his earlier books, the first chapter is called Joaquin's Dilemma. And this kind of set me on a path to first be curious, why would my father put me in this book? And second, what is the relationship here between racial identity and school-related behaviors? Is there a relationship? I felt even just the suggestion was prescriptive in somewhat, right? It kind of gave me a lens to then begin to see the relationship and to interrogate, to wonder more. As I said, it kind of put me on a path. I studied sociology and history as an undergraduate, but when I got out, I got into social work. I was working in Central Harlem with 14 to 21-year-olds, providing different kinds of support, academic support, kind of mentoring support, but also at times advocacy in legal spaces, in community family spaces. And it taught me a lot about what was possible from that position. I was not content, however, and eventually opportunity to become a teacher. And I accepted. I became an assistant in a kindergarten classroom. So I left working with 14 to 21-year-olds and started working with 4, 5, and 6-year-olds. And it was a deeply humbling experience. I took that position 6 months after my mother passed away. And I think it was one of the most healing experiences I could have taken part in. It's quite a thing to show up at work. You're kind of frazzled. You're maybe just got off a subway where you got a bunch of strangers all around you, and people are not really talking, not being friendly, and then all of a sudden a baby comes up to you, not baby, but 5-year-old says, "Daddy, I mean, Mr. Noguera." Right, and I was changed quite a bit by my teaching experiences. I had the pleasure and privilege of working with students from K to 12 and had experience teaching in all grades except 2nd, 4th, and 11th. I served as a school leader in New York City in 2 schools, and also had the privilege of working with youth outside of schools. 14 to 19-year-olds for an International Youth Leadership Institute. And through that work, I had the pleasure of taking young people around the world. It was an organization dedicated to serving Black and Latinx youth in New York City. We went to Egypt, South Africa, Puerto Rico, and Brazil, which taught me a lot about what was possible outside of learning, outside of formal learning spaces, outside of schools, as well as how learning was approached in these different countries and in the small communities that we were a part of. Because these were academic trips, we also took classes there, and we embedded ourselves in the community. After doing that work, I was recruited to become a consultant. And I worked for a British consulting company for 4 years that took me across the country, doing a wide range of school development and improvement work. from leadership development and teaching, coaching teachers, curriculum design, district level support, strategic planning, just about any matter of school development and improvement. And I wanted to share with you all just three stories that three experiences I had in schools that kind of charged me up and sent me back to school, sent me back to get my graduate degree. So the first one took place in Brooklyn, New York. It was with a high school where I was working with social studies and English language arts teachers on pedagogical practices and curriculum design. And in one government class, an 11th grade government class, where there was a teacher, he was from Long Island, he was a white man. He really wanted to do well by his students. He was in his second year of teaching, he was very nervous. We had the time to prepare his first unit for the year. It was on government. He had an essential question: what is the purpose of government? And we walked through his plans and we practiced, we rehearsed, he was really nervous and I was excited for him. And on the first day of class, I was sitting in on his lesson and he was on fire. Had his essential question on the board, asking students, popcorn calling on them. They're all answering this question: what is the purpose of government? And it looked great. It was a good start. But about 10 minutes into the class, the door opened and a student came in. It was a Black male student. He had his hoodie on his head and he had his headphones playing music. It was really loud. You could hear the music. And he walked in, he didn't say anything, just kind of quietly walked in, put his head down, went to the back of the room. Music was still blasting. So the teacher stopped, he kind of looked around, went over to said something quietly to the student. The student took off his hoodie, turned the music off. And he said, well, what about you? What do you think? What's the purpose of government? And the student said, government is a gang. And the teacher said, I'm going to come back to you when you're ready. And we had to debrief that, because while I was pleased that he engaged the student to re-engage into the class, I think he missed an opportunity to invite that student into the lesson and to invite that student's perspective as a form of knowledge construction for other students to consider, to actually make the learning relevant to young people's lives. I'm gonna pause there with that story. The next case is a case of in Newark, New Jersey, where I went into a high school, and while I was waiting in line, this was again the first day, this is actually my first assignment as a consultant. With the team of consultants, we were in line waiting to go through the metal detector, and I saw an adult man talking with a student, and he cursed at the student. He called him a name. And the student and he went back and forth. And then he took off his hoodie, the adult, and I saw he was a school safety officer. I was surprised by that. I walked into the school. We had been called there to support discipline issues. And I was in the hallway and I could see it was a pretty chaotic scene. It actually reminded me of when I was a student, and me and my friends would find ourselves in the hallway with no teachers around. It was kind of that excitement, that buzz you feel when you're free. And we spent a lot of time in classes, and I saw some really disturbing behaviors in there, but I also saw some of the most boring lessons I'd ever seen. And at the end of the day, I went back to the teacher, the principal, and I said, you know, discipline is clearly an issue, but I think we have some systemic issues. And he said, well, what do you mean by that? And I said, well, you know, the lessons aren't very engaging, and there are issues of race that maybe we want to look at. And the principal requested that I not come back. Didn't want to talk about systemic issues, wanted to focus on discipline. It was brought to my attention, not only do I need to be sensitive when I enter school spaces, because these are not just public issues, these are very personal issues that we're tackling, but you're going to have to navigate what people do and don't know, right? The next example is an example of Grand Rapids, Michigan. I visited a high school where I was supposed to support a turnaround experience. I got there and I got a group of teachers, really engaged teachers who were excited to support learning and change, and said, let's look at the data. We want to look at the data. Let's look at data by race. And the lead teacher of the English department said, well, why are we making this racial? And I looked at the data and I put it up on a projector, and I said, well, the highest scores for any subgroup have been in the 30th percentile. But for Black students, for 3 years in a row, we've had 0% proficiency in English language arts. And he said, yeah, but why are we making it about race? And I wasn't sure what to say to him at that point, but it also taught me that there's a resistance to looking at issues of race and racism. There's a resistance partly because people don't really understand. Some people don't know, or they really do understand. And yet they've taken a position where they don't want to go there. The last example is an example of a school in Los Angeles, where I worked with a teacher to prepare a lesson. It was, again, an issue of discipline in a kindergarten classroom. And unfortunately, the teacher started the lesson by calling on a student and asking them, in an attempt to be responsive, what part of Mexico are you from? And the little boy stood up and he kind of looked confused and he looked around. And she said it again, louder and slower. What part of Mexico or Mexico is your grandmother from? He kind of looked puzzled and he said, El Salvador? And I share these examples with you because they were troubling to me, but they also inspired me to then decide I needed to go back to school. There were some serious limitations in terms of the change that I saw I could have given my role as a consultant. And I needed to know more. I need to know how we got there, right? I started to see some patterns. I saw patterns that we were working with mostly Black and brown communities, usually working class, poor communities. And I began to wonder what was stopping us from actually engaging those students and their families more meaningfully. And I wondered what would be required of us to provide a holistic learning experience for historically oppressed peoples in this country. With those questions, I went back to grad school and I organized myself and I began to study with some brilliant thinkers so that I could engage what I see as a national problem. And the way I describe the problem is that across the United States, districts, schools, and teachers are confronting the dilemma that public education is facing today. It's the challenge of ensuring that all children, regardless of background, regardless of race, language, religion, gender, or sexuality, receive the kind of education that can prepare them with the skills and knowledge and understandings necessary for fulfilling and successful life. I word it this way because I'm a teacher. I've been teaching for years and I've been a school leader and I definitely have these experiences have shaped how I see things. But the other side is a problem that is just as important, if not more. And that is the problem of families, especially poor working class families of color, are struggling to find schools where the academic, the social, and the emotional needs of their children are understood, appreciated, and nurtured. And we're now in a time where more than ever before in my life that I can remember, people are ready to talk about it, and many are ready to do the work. So, considering how scholars, how researchers have been talking about this, some have described this work as addressing the achievement gap. Dr. Tyrone Howard at UCLA, a mentor of mine, has described the achievement gap as disparities in academic outcomes between Black, Indigenous, and Latinx students and their white and certain Asian American peers, usually reflected in grades, test scores, discipline records, graduation rates, suspension, etc. Importantly, some have challenged the view of the achievement gap, which is usually conceptualized very narrowly. And Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings has argued that we have an educational debt. Here we're dealing with historically oppressed peoples. We have to see the gap as not a leading indicator, but a lagging indicator. It's actually secondary. It's the result of many other things. There's a debt. We have an accumulation of justice. There's been lack of access. Racial discrimination is what's shaped these gaps. Still others have said, this is about opportunity. It's an opportunity gap. It's a teacher and student gap. There's a mismatch. There's research that shows that students, all students, but students of color also especially, benefit from having teachers of color, and Black students benefit from having at least one Black teacher in their K-12 experience. It makes it more likely for them to go to college. But we have a mismatch in that our teaching force is predominantly more than 80% white women, and our student body is not. Our student body is very diverse. Still others have said that it's a social emotional issue. It's about meeting the social emotional or maybe holistic needs of young people. And in fact, trauma, as widespread as it is in this society, is all too common viewed as something else, right? So it's mislabeled as an attention deficit disorder, some kind of oppositional defiance. And what that does is it prevents folks from looking deeper, right, into what is serving as a barrier to engagement or to success for young people and their families. Taking a socio-historical position, I assert that we can't lose sight of the historical context here, right? And it's important to remember that this is a settler colonial society. I'm reminded of that, and was reminded of that as I engaged in the study that I'll be sharing with you all today, partly because Oakland, where the school that I studied is located, is being rapidly gentrified. And so just to be clear, colonialism, what people often describe as colonialism, is usually external colonialism. In the past 30-ish years or so, folks have made some distinctions between external colonialism and what is now termed settler colonialism. Settler colonialism is a form of colonization where outsiders come in and claim land as their own. It is the context for the destruction of indigenous peoples and to acquire their land, and the enslavement of people from the continent of Africa. Importantly, there's a precursor to our notion of race in the Western societies, that is the settler native slave triad. And it's a collapsible triad that conveniently adapts or rejects as needed. I argue that it's been operationalized through racial capitalism, through white supremacy, through anti-Blackness and indigenous erasure. And the systems and structures and practices and processes of a settler colonial state serve that goal of naturalizing, normalizing the settler worldview, and serving to erase or reject indigenous and those who are deemed unworthy or second-class settlers. This is also something that is actively being denied right now, right? There are states in the country where people are saying, we can't have this taught in our schools. It's a threat, right? It's a threat to actually acknowledge the history. They say, this is not our history. Well, I like to point to Brother Malcolm, who reminded us that racism is like a Cadillac. They bring out a new model every year. And so as we come to know the newest, latest, updated version of oppressive strategies, racist strategies, we're usually a little late because there's another version that's on its way, right? So we're still talking about January 6th, and there's mobilization that's taking place right now. It's unending, it's a continuous process because settler colonialism is not just an event, but an ongoing process. And part of the reason I say that this is important is because within the settler colonial worldview and practice is this notion of the frontier. The frontier is important, I think, because it is part of the mythology that the settler colonists create and use to justify their actions. This image here is a well-known image of many people would describe as manifest destiny. It's called American Progress. It's from the 1870s. And the image shows Lady Liberty carrying a book and as she travels from east to west. It's a symbolic representation of an attempt to civilize this continent. Out with the indigenous people, out with the animals. The darkness is over there and they're bringing light. Okay. Importantly, she's carrying a book And as several have reminded of us, Django Paris and Samuel Leem are some of the more recent contributors to this thinking, but Carter G. Woodson and Paulo Freire are also contributors to this thinking. The history of education in this country was born out of a tradition that didn't serve all of us equally. And as they say quite clearly, state-sanctioned schooling has been used to forward a largely assimilationist and often violent white imperial project, with students and families being asked to lose or deny their languages, literacies, cultures, and histories in order to achieve in schools. Freire also talked about education either functioning as a way to liberate or to incorporate the next generation into an oppressive system. I borrow from these, and I assert that what we're dealing with here today is a system of frontier education, taking frontier, the notion of the frontier of the settler colony, and applying it to the ideological state apparatus, which is schooling. And I tend to use this image, school begins, to engage folks in critical thinking around what it actually means. Where Uncle Sam is a representative of the state, and regardless of your background, regardless of the teacher's background, they have certain obligations because they too are representatives of the state. But in this image, which was from the 1890s, just after the Spanish-American War, just around the time of the Chinese Exclusion Act, the first immigration law in this country, not everyone has the same relationship in this classroom to learning and or to the state. So it's not just a historical foundation, but it's also a continuing process that I believe is recreated through strains placed on schools, on educators in schools, even well-intentioned educators. And unfortunately, this is part of what schooling does still. Many classrooms look just like this image. Well, what we've seen across the country is through reform efforts are usually really narrow takes on what can be done. Many have written about a neoliberal paradigm, the global education reform movement, the GERM, right? That creates incentives for privatizing, uses accountability measures to discipline schools, to punish communities. We've blamed educators. We ignore the social and economic context. And there been decision-making has been top down instead of community engaged. All of this has contributed to a loss of confidence in schools and in educators, and ultimately creating a crisis in this country around education. It was in wrapping my mind around all of this, and just before actually starting graduate school, I received an email on December 15th. It was titled, "Build Our Own School Agenda," for December 29th. And I was invited to this meeting where a new school was going to be created. And in the email, there was a draft of the vision statement. This is an old draft. It says, "At Roses in Concrete, we emphasize knowledge of self, character, and spiritual growth to prepare students to fundamentally impact their community and global society. Their goal is to develop youth committed to lives characterized by self-discipline, integrity, love, and hope. And they encourage students who are broadly invested in academic, artistic, and extracurricular pursuits to demonstrate genuine concern for others and generosity of spirit." I thought, wow, that's different than a lot of those other schools I was visiting, right? And I was unable to make the meeting, but I stayed in touch with the founders. I stayed in touch with the folks who were hired there. And I came to learn that it was a school that was inspired by, as I imagined, because I was a fan of Tupac, and I still am. It was inspired by a poem by Tupac Shakur, "The Rose That Grew from the Concrete." And in this way, it used the metaphor of growing roses in concrete to give a charge for the school, to break up the concrete and create an environment where many roses could flourish, right? We didn't want just one rose breaking through. We want all our roses to break through, right? We want to create a garden. So I decided to invest some time, some energy into the school. In 2014, I led a pilot study on the intentions of the founders. And between 2016 and 2017, I volunteered as a coach to teachers and as a thinking partner to school leaders. In the 2018 school year, I spent a total of 51 days on campus, and I remained in touch with several community members after that point. So this engagement took place over the course of 6 years. Ultimately, I did a dissertation study on the school, and my overarching question on the school was, how does a school that is deliberately designed to counter the adverse conditions in a low-income urban community meet the social, emotional, and academic needs of the students and communities that it serves? Now, this is a big question, and it had many other components to it. Today, I'm just gonna kind of deal with a few, okay? Because I had to kind of unravel all of that, right? So in addition, I want you to know, what did this look like in practice? What are the systems, structures, practices, and processes that they use? What kind of obstacles do they find or encounter, and how do they navigate these obstacles? So this is really what guided the research that I did over the course of those years. And that's what I'm going to share with you all today. The study was a critical ethnographic case study. Case study, for those who are less familiar with research, is really about a bounded system, something that's contained. So I'm not analyzing all schools. It's not comparative necessarily. I'm not comparing roses with other schools, even though as I was doing this work, I was working with other schools. So other schools did inform my lens. But it's also a critical ethnographic case study. And that means that as a critical ethnographic study, we assume and we recognize that we're not on an even playing field, right? Different cultures, different groups of people are positioned unequally in society because we have different access to power and resources. I was also motivated by certain theoretical and methodological considerations. One being inspired by Linda Tuhiwai Smith, recognition that research has actually been used to forward colonial endeavors, right? There's a long history of research that has been extractive, taking people's words, taking people's ideas, and benefiting personally without giving back, right? And she argues that you actually need to, there needs to be some reciprocity. It's very closely related to, and it has inspired the critical indigenous research methodologies, which argue that permission has to be granted. Right? So I engaged the community, I spoke to leaders and offered myself to them and said, how can I help? I believe in this project, I want to study it, but I also want to give. So critical indigenous research methodologies are guided by relationality, responsibility, respect, and reciprocity. Finally, critical race methodologies, that big bad critical race theory there, y'all. A lot of folks don't understand it, but critical race methodologies actually argue, are motivated and moved by a recognition that race and racism are present, right? It's not in question, it's there. And we have to center the experiences of students and people of color, okay? So it challenges traditional research paradigms, and it's interdisciplinary, right? These are kind of the ways of moving through the school and through my research that guided me. I spent, again, a significant amount of time, but between 2016 and 2018 is when I gathered the majority of my data. I engaged in interviews, observations, gathered documents. I was on this school at all times. So I was even following it in the media. I would get alerts, Google alerts. So anytime there would be a story about it. And I became friends with people who worked there. I knew people who worked there before they started working there. And in total, I had conducted 48 interviews, 31 participants, majority of whom were school staff. It's important also just to kind of situate this in the historical moment, right? 2016 is the election of Donald Trump. We also had the Flint water crisis. We had the Pulse nightclub shooting. This is part of what was happening around this country. We had 2017, the Women's March. We had Hurricane Maria. We had other hurricanes as well. We had the tiki torches in Charlottesville. We had Kaepernick and the NFL taking a knee. And in 2018, we had the March for Our Lives. We had news of children being separated from families. And in the Bay Area, we had the killing of Stephon Clark in his own backyard. All of this was significant. Some of the work I was doing is significant in terms of how I saw roses. But some of the work I was doing at the time while working with roses, this is what working students are doing. They're working on real projects while doing work that really matters. I was engaged in equity work with a few schools, one in the Bay Area, a couple of schools down here in Southern California. I was working with the district in Illinois to support the racial equity initiative across the district. I was supporting a study of Indigenous language immersion programs, a national study. And I was also working with a few scholars up in the Bay Area on a healing-centered engagement with young people, and as well as faculty of one of the universities up in the Bay Area. One of the high schools, this is just an example of how schools were being affected. One of the high schools I was working with in Southern California at the time, I was in a hallway the day of Trump's inauguration, and I came across this image. And just an example of how the social and cultural issues outside of schools penetrate schools, right? This was the spirit of the times. And the returning to the Bay Area to conduct research also took me back home, took me back to a place that I knew. I grew up in South Berkeley, right on the border of North Oakland. So over here you have a little map that shows Berkeley in purple, North Oakland. The map is, the border is not a straight line. So some of your neighbors are in Oakland, sometimes you're in Berkeley, but if you didn't grow up there, you might miss some things. Coming back to that space, I was reminded of a lot. In fact, when I started engaging roses in 2016, I believe, I got news of a close friend who had passed away. And I was tagged on Facebook on a picture, this picture over here. This is a 4th grade class trip, and my friend who had passed away was in this image. He's a Black guy, and he was also dressed as a Confederate soldier. And I just thought it ironic, perhaps even indicative of the frontier practices that are even normalized in places like Berkeley, right, which prides itself on being a very progressive, liberal haven. So these are the things that informed my engagement, my analysis of what I was seeing. Oakland is a very diverse working class city with a large Black and Latinx population. It has been going through quite a few challenges in recent years, past few decades, right? Including state takeover of the district, several threats of strikes. And ultimately, for the people who are from there, there's still violence that people live with day to day. These were things that I remembered when I got there, as well as the history of Bay Area, right? There's a strong history of activism, self-determination movements in the Bay Area. And I've just listed a few because I wondered, and I didn't just wonder, but I did wonder how these might inform roses. And I wanted to see where there would be evidence of inspiration from past movements. How would that surface in the ways of teachers and leaders in the community, in the Roses community? So I can't take you to Roses, but I'm gonna give you just a sample of some of the sounds and the visuals of Roses. So this is a very brief video that I'm gonna share with you all, and I hope you enjoy it. And I'm gonna continue to share my findings with you after. So it's brief, and I hope you soak it up.
Tell you you ain't special. Don't let nobody act like you ain't mental. Achieve at an all-time high. We are the children of an all-time God, and sometimes all-time still take a little while. Hope is multi-generational for Black and brown. We grew a garden back in August, but in August now. We growing roses in concrete pockets, smiling down. On the least of us, the left out and the look over. God bless the mamas who know how to stretch them leftovers. We say our prayers and we take another step forward. Who shall we fear if the Lord is going to stand for us? Nobody. They systems that could never win. Sons of the sun, you can see it in our melanin. Fist in the air, freedom fighters, we ain't settling. On this road to heaven, and we got to go through hell again. Put medicine into every word you speak. Continually around. And in the call upon the deepest layers of our
So I spent a lot of time in the field with the Roses. And one of the things that stood out most when I was at Roses was the way that people talked. I've spent a lot of time in a lot of schools. I still do. And it was the first school where in the teacher's lounge, you didn't just hear teachers talking bad about students. You actually heard people talking about students as they were talking about roses. They referred to students as roses. There's something that shifts in a space when we change the way that we talk. It changes the way we see each other. And I found it to be really powerful. As I engaged the school, I found that it was indeed a special case. Okay, it was the first school where it was organized around the idea that adults can serve as buffers to toxic environments and toxic stress. They attempted to organize themselves around an internalization or an operationalization of Maslow's hierarchy of need. That is that if we meet people's basic needs, we can help them to be their best selves, okay? And they articulated this through the image that you can see down here at the bottom in terms of how we grow roses, right? How do we get to this level of self-actualization? And the vision ultimately was about the school being a pathway to healthy and sustainable communities. So part of the finding is that Roses had an educational program that was aligned with this vision, right? They ultimately decided to go charter, which I'm going to talk a little bit about towards the end of this talk. But they were clearly a social justice space. They used ethnic studies to make their curriculum engaging. They decided to become a Spanish-English dual immersion school. And part of the rationale was that it would support Black and Brown unity. They had an awesome arts program, a budding STEMs program, and they demonstrated that it had real solidarity with the students and the families that they served. So one finding is that the Roses and Concrete Community School, through that educational program, through who they hired, was a counter to the frontier education model that I saw in so many other communities. And what that means is that their staff demographics closely mirrored the student community that they served, the families that they worked with, that they worked in solidarity, that they offered an alternative success model, right? It wasn't like, you know, some models actually reject the idea that families can contribute to the well-being of students. In this case, they had the concept of the warrior scholar, and the warrior scholar is someone who's able to succeed in the existing system, but change it. And they had a goal of establishing unity between Black and Brown community members. So in terms of what I mean by a counter to frontier education, what I mean by community responsive, student population was almost half Black, African-American, and Latinx, and the staff was pretty much the same. A quote from one of the teachers here is that we have all teachers of color. There are no white teachers here. I don't mean to say that white people can't do this work. What I'm saying is that politically we've chosen to present ourselves in a particular way. Most importantly, to our children and our communities, that there are folks of color here doing this work. That's not a common precedent for schools, for working in schools. And when you look at the children we're serving, they're also 98% students of color. So what are we doing well? We're committing ourselves to a body of work that is not unprecedented. People have done this before, But in regards to Oakland, in regard to time and space, it's very audacious to do that. And we're doing it. When we look at the job hiring process and some of the promotional material when used to recruit, the first thing listed that I like to point out is that it's something that I don't see at any other schools really. The first thing that teachers must do is aspire to love each and every student as if they were a member of your family. One mother told me that something that she can always say is that she can look around campus and know that everyone loves her kid. And that's something that I've never ever felt anywhere, anything close to where he's gone. And everybody is here because they genuinely love kids and love families. And it's not like pobrecito love. It's like that I love you and I'm going to hold you to high expectations and I'm going to do everything I can to support you reaching your limitless potential sort of love. These are just some images that show how teachers worked in solidarity with students and families. In a second grade classroom, young girls in a girls group were encouraged to become critical of American beauty standards, right? This is about early engagement in critical consciousness. Right? There's solidarity with migrant families, immigrant families, folks worried, concerned about DACA and their status. And then this idea of the warrior scholar, the idea of someone who can be successful in a system, but actively work to change it. As one stakeholder told me, the point is not to escape the hood, the point is to transform the hood. Young people have to develop an appreciation for their own community and for their people. Otherwise, the dominant narrative will teach you that you need to get out of there. And then we've lost another person who could help. Okay. This is another quote from one of the stakeholders, one of the school leaders actually. They said that a warrior scholar has to know where they come from. They have a good moral compass. Also very conscious about the development of the mind and developing strategy. That way, no challenge on the battlefield is something that you can't work your way out of or figure out. In addition, over time, I came to see, and part of the reason I engaged for so much time is because having worked with so many schools, I know that if you just take a snapshot, you're really not going to get an understanding of what a school is doing. But what I came to see was that this is out of order. The school was responding to harm at the community and at the individual level. Okay, I came to differentiate between the different kinds of harm by calling wounds the structural and historical harm that shapes communities and influences even identity, and the hurt, the day-to-day hurt that people experience throughout our lives, right? Life be alive, carry hurt. And the school had to respond to both forms. So I'm gonna give you a couple of examples of wounds, one example of wounds, one example of hurt. This is a wound is the restoration of trust in teachers, the restoration of trust in schools. This teacher told me, I've noticed that for some parents, their guard is up all the time, no matter what, no matter how many attempts I make to massage the relationships, they're always just an there's always an us and them mentality. It's like you're trying to prove that you're loyal, but they're just looking at every single move you make like it's suspicious. I've noticed that the families that have the greatest needs are the ones that attack the most. I said, that's deep. How was it resolved? This was a specific situation where a parent had come to that teacher and pressed them. He said, well, you know, I gave it a few days. I let the parent chill, you chill, and then you kind of gingerly get back to it. And really, the teacher has to kind of pay it forward. I try to honor them, even though they were offensive. And then we can work it out. We can work out how to communicate properly. But I won't let people trample all over me. Eventually, they will heal, and actually, they will become stronger, but healing hurts. This is in sharp contrast to some spaces where I had been, where teachers had actually advocated to have court orders that certain parents could stay away after conflicts, right? This space was a bit different. An example of day-to-day hurt was a student who was 12 years old, had been the night before roughed up by the cops. And when that student came to the school, I'd seen them in a classroom where there was a long-term sub, and they got kicked out. And so I saw them on the playground playing basketball by themselves, and I went to go play with them. And one of the school culture leaders came over and said, I remember when he was a really big 4th grader, and now he's a really big 6th grader. When he deserves to be able to come to school and unpack that experience. School can be that for him. I believe he's going to really feel seen, heard, and connected. And I believe that those are things that help students buy into the system. Seen, heard, connected. If you hear me speaking in something that I don't feel connected to, that doesn't count as connection. I might participate in your class, but I don't feel connected to the instruction. That doesn't qualify as connection just because I'm using my voice. Participation isn't connection. I asked, what is connection? He said, taking a journey inward, helping a young person see inward and then project outward. Education has got to be a tool that helps them go inward, to pull out from their experiences, from what they've seen, and from what they haven't coded yet. I know with certainty that students coming into age in this America need that. They need that as a survival mechanism, as a critical thinking mechanism. They need it as a way to put their experiences into context, to find strength in their fight, to find hope in their light. And without it, what are you teaching them? What that student told me on the basketball court gives me a clear instruction on my teaching for the remainder of his 6th grade year. Every day I know what I should be teaching and unpacking. Every day I need to be creating invitations for him to go inward. I'm glad he told me that. And I'm glad that he told me that when he did, because I needed clarity on my assignment. So the teacher took it as a charge and clear sense of direction for that teacher, how he was going to engage for the rest of the year. Another really important finding was that I came to see only after years of engaging was that roses don't come out of nowhere. Roses come from other roses. And it didn't take me long. I knew some families that were, I'd gone to school with people who brought their children to school. And I saw people who I remembered them as children. I remember them when they were the roses. And so it helped me to see that if roses come from other roses, then the same level of compassion and caring and engagement that we bring to students has to be extended to families. It helped me to see that really, if we want to be critical in our engagement with equity work, then it has to be about giving kids what they need to be academically and socially successful. It has to be about eliminating barriers, of course, but it also has to do with organizing the school so that our skills match their needs and engaging families in the same manner. What does it mean for a school to really engage families in meaningful ways? I also learned that roses have thorns. Real roses do. The manicured ones don't, right? You clip those off. So a very important finding, and unlike a lot of researchers, I embedded myself in that community. I let myself be known, and the school wanted to be known as well. I didn't come up with a different name for the school. I brought this to the school. Honestly, I said, these are the things that I found. I also found that internally, there was a lack of alignment with the vision and mission. Some things were very well aligned, some things were not. The things that were not were costly. There's a lack of strategic capacity building to match the needs, and ultimately a high turnover rate among teachers and leaders. 5 principals in 5 years means you're reinventing every year. If you lose half of your teachers in 1 year, you're reinventing in ways that you really can't afford to, not if your goal is transformation and healing. So as an example of internal organizational alignment, internally, this is from one of the staff members, a teacher. Internally, what we have to develop teachers are meetings. This was in year 3. So I would say that this year, there are just less conversations. There are a lot of fires in terms of administrative fires, staffing, budget fires. So it's taken away from the internal development that needs to be done. And I would say that number 1, classroom management is an Achilles heel, especially for new teachers. Another example is people not getting formal training, the training that they need. So this is with a staff member, not a teacher, that I knew I would probably be asked to be in a lot of different spaces and take on different responsibilities, but I didn't get any formal training. This person had been there for more than a year. Said I was inevitably mentored, especially by this one teacher who's created space for me. I remember toward the beginning, I was a witness to a pretty serious altercation between students. There was physical, and one young girl got really harmed, and I was like, okay, I don't know how to handle this, and I was able to stop what was physically happening, but then I was like, what are the ramifications of this? And how do we go on talking to our student? I knew from the beginning that it would be a restorative justice approach, but I was not familiar with that. I had background knowledge on it, but I didn't have experience. I reached out to the dean my first year to get an overview, but I didn't get any follow-up. So part of the takeaway here is that the traditional demands of schools are not alleviated when we take an anti-hegemonic stance. It's really important to take an anti-hegemonic stance, but it's also important to know the environment. And in conversation with one of the school leaders towards in the 5th year, they told me that they were talking with one of the charter organizations in California. They said, are you reading scores evident of student progress? Are reading scores evidence of student progress? And they immediately said, yes. He said, okay, is cultural identity evidence of student progress? And they said, no. He said, well, then we're done here. You don't have the authority to evaluate us because we're a community school. We have the right to self-determine what progress is for our own children, and that includes me. I'm speaking to you as a parent whose children go to this school, and I'm telling you, I'm more interested in whether or not my children, my sons, have a strong cultural identity than what their scores are on the state reading test. I'm not saying I don't care if my students can read, my children can read. I'm saying that I know if my sons can read and they don't know who they are, where they come from, that they're going to be sick. Ultimately, this leader said that the charter group was morally defunct. And it led to the closure of the school. It wasn't the deciding factor, but ultimately the charter was not renewed. This is the old space that they occupied, John Swett School, and they did successfully attempt to repurpose the school. On the one hand, charters are a part of a history that is problematic. Many chose to go charter shortly after Brown versus Board in order to escape integration. But there's also a tradition of a number of people of color organizing themselves to practice self-determination.
Yeah, hi, Jessa. I need to check something. I deposited money in my
Hi, Joy.
yesterday with a, by taking a picture of my check, and but I don't see it in my account records.
Can somebody handle that?
So do I do it again? But I don't want to do it again.
So I bring us back to the Black feminist argument, or rather the argument by Black feminist Audre Lorde, which is really important, especially in social justice spaces, that the master's tools will not be dismantled, used to dismantle the master's house. They can be used to temporarily beat him at his own game, but never enable us to bring about genuine change. And I would say that this is important and to recognize we need to be innovative in creating new tools, but we also need to question, did the master really build that house? Right? There's a lot that we can do around repurposing the systems and structures that we're navigating. So there's some implications here that I just want to clarify. For those who are dedicated to this work of using education to forward change, there's a lot to learn from Roses as a counter-hegemonic school, and repurposing the school to be community responsive. There are implications here for teacher education and preparation of school leaders. The challenges that Roses face are the same challenges that other schools across the country are facing, but they chose to take them on intentionally. Right? They weren't just reacting, although they did at times have to react, and that was a big part of their struggle. It speaks to the unfittedness of equity work in education and the need to embrace a holistic way of engaging students to actualize a vision, right? It's about a practice and a praxis of democracy. It's about really engaging those who have been underserved by our schools. It's a reminder that the lived experiences of our students matter, that the wounds and day-to-day hurt matter, and we cannot ignore the social and cultural conditions in our society. Importantly, it's a reminder that taking away pride in who you are and pride in your people is a form of genocide, and schools that engage in that work are violent. It's also a reminder that schooling can be a space to pursue freedom. Marriage is what I've been calling it in the case of retaking a space and attempting to be responsive to those who are typically underserved as a form of schooling for marriage. In addition, it shows the power of ethnic studies, power of supporting culturally sustaining, revitalizing, and healing engagement work. We need warrior scholars, but warrior scholars also have to be equipped with healing strategies. Otherwise, they may just be martyrs. This is true for students, this is true for teachers. Roses was far from perfect, but it's also important to recognize the power and potential of a school that really engages students and families with authentic love and respect. The work is not easy, and good intentions are not enough. We have to make sure that our system, structures, practices, and processes are aligned with our goals. It also brings attention to the purpose and the importance of a healing-centered community school and applying the lens of roses to community, to families, to parents. It's a case study that demonstrates the possibilities and limitations of using education forward social change and shows how the demands, the traditional demands, don't go away when we choose to take an anti-hegemonic stance. Finally, that the problems that we face in urban education, yes, we need sweeping change, but we are not necessarily going to have sweeping change immediately. So we have to respond to the urgency of now. We have to be able to actively work to alleviate the hardship that folks deal with day to day. If we don't, even the ambitious change is not likely to succeed. Having concluded this study, it is informing future directions for my work. Some of the questions that I'm asking are how we can support educators, teachers, leaders, schools, as well as whole districts to deliberately organize themselves or reorganize themselves to meet the social, emotional, and academic needs of students and support transformation and healing, to be ultimately community responsive. It has to do with expanding teacher and leader preparation programs to implement ethnic studies K-12, which is one of the fastest moving initiatives and one of the most important moving initiatives on the horizon for schooling right now, especially in the state of California. And many teacher education programs are really unprepared for this. It also has to do with understanding healing-centered and culturally sustaining, revitalizing systems, structures, practices, and processes. And I not only want to and am involved in the creation of those things, but to study their impact, their challenges, and the different manifestations of what it means for different kind of learning spaces. Thank you so much for the opportunity to share these experiences, these lessons with you all. I'm gonna share it back.
Thank you very much, Joaquin.